The blood was the first thing she saw, a stark, frozen blossom of crimson against the unforgiving white of the snow. Alara stumbled, her breath catching in her throat, a puff of white vapor that was instantly snatched away by the wind. The wind was a living thing in these mountains, a malevolent spirit that shrieked like tortured souls and clawed at her thin coat with icy talons. It sought the last vestiges of warmth from her body, and from the small, shivering form of her sister, Lily, who was clutching her hand with a grip of surprising strength. The bloodstain was a macabre signpost, leading to the rough-hewn door of the cabin that was their only hope. Desperation, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, had driven them this far, up into the jagged teeth of the mountains where the sky was the color of a bruised iron and civilization was a forgotten dream. She pulled Lily closer, shielding the child's face from the worst of the gale. "We're almost there, sweetling," Alara whispered, the words nearly frozen on her lips. They were a lie, and they both knew it. They were not almost there. They were at the very end of their rope, fugitives from a world that had chewed them up and spit them out into this frozen wasteland. Behind them, miles and a lifetime away, was the ghost of her husband, Daniel, dead not from illness or accident, but from the slow, grinding despair of debt. And with his death, the debt had transferred, not to a bank or a ledger, but to the man who held the note, Silas Blackwood. Silas, with his manicured hands and his smile that never reached his cold, possessive eyes. He had owned Daniel's labor, and now he believed he owned Daniel's widow. He had made his intentions clear in the suffocating quiet of his opulent office, the scent of expensive leather and hypocrisy thick in the air. He spoke of arrangements, of her and Lily being taken care of, but his gaze was a brand, marking her as property. When she had refused, her voice a trembling whisper of defiance, his civilized mask had slipped. The rage that flashed in his eyes was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen, more frightening even than the poverty that had haunted her steps since Daniel's passing. He had given her an ultimatum: be his in all the ways that mattered, or he would see her ruined, tossed into the street with nothing. He would take the small plot of land that was all she had left, and he would ensure no one would ever help her. His power in the valley was absolute, a web of favors and corruption that ensnared everyone. So she had run. In the dead of night, with Lily asleep in her arms and a small satchel containing their few pathetic belongings, Alara had fled. Not east or west toward other towns where Blackwood's influence might reach, but north up into the Granite Mom Mountains, a place spoken of in hushed, fearful tones. It was a place where lawmen did not go, where nature itself was the only authority. And it was the home, so the desperate whispers said, of a man as wild and unforgiving as the mountains themselves. Jedediah. The name was a legend, a campfire story to frighten children. A giant of a man who lived alone, a recluse who had turned his back on the world. He had placed an advertisement in a gazette from a town 2 valleys over, an advertisement so stark and strange it had been the talk of the general store for a week. Seeking a wife. Must be strong, not afraid of silence or solitude. Passage paid. It was a madman's plea or a monster's trap. But for Alara, it had been a sliver of impossible hope. Using the last of her money, she had sent a telegram, a frantic, anonymous acceptance, lying that she was the woman from the advertisement, praying the real one had never shown. She gave a false name and a meeting point at a derelict rail depot miles from anywhere, a place she hoped Blackwood would not think to look. Her plan was desperate and thin. Find this mountain man, this Jedediah, and beg for sanctuary. She was not the strong, unafraid woman his advertisement called for. She was a grieving widow, a hunted fugitive with the backbone of a jellyfish, and she was terrified. But she had Lily, and for Lily, she would face any monster, even one who lived in a cabin marked by a splash of frozen blood. She pushed the heavy wooden door. It groaned open on leather hinges, revealing a scene of controlled chaos. The inside of the cabin was a single, large room, dominated by a huge stone fireplace where embers glowed with a sullen, dying light. Furs were piled on a rough-hewn bed frame, and the air smelled of pine, wood smoke, and something else. Something metallic and sharp. Sprawled on the floor, halfway between the door and the hearth, was a man. He was enormous, a mountain of muscle and leather and beard, and from a deep, vicious gash in his thigh, blood was seeping, pooling on the floorboards and explaining the stain outside. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow. He was the monster from the legends, and he was dying. For a long moment, Ilara simply stared, the wind howling at her back, pushing her into the room. Lily whimpered, hiding her face in the folds of Ilara's skirt. This was him, Jedediah. He was even more intimidating than the story suggested. His face, half hidden by a thick, dark beard, was a roadmap of a hard life, crisscrossed with old scars. A long-barreled rifle lay near one outstretched hand, its stock worn smooth with use. He looked less like a man and more like a force of nature, a hibernating grizzly bear that had been mortally wounded. Her first instinct, born of a lifetime of fear, was to back away, to pull the door shut and take her chances with the blizzard, to run from this new, unknown danger. But the blizzard was certain death, and this man, this giant, was helpless. The sight of his vulnerability stirred something in her, a flicker of empathy that fought against the terror. He had been hurt badly. The blood trail suggested he had dragged himself here, a supreme act of will against the storm and his injury. He was not a monster standing over them, but a man laid low, and he was their only chance. Taking a shuddering breath that felt like swallowing needles, Ilara pushed the door closed against the shrieking wind, plunging the cabin into a dim, fire-lit twilight. The world outside vanished, leaving only the three of them in this isolated pocket of tenuous survival. "Lily, go to the fire," she said, her voice strained. "Stay there and get warm." The little girl, her eyes wide with fear but accustomed to obeying her sister without question, scurried to the hearth, huddling as close to the dying embers as she dared. Ilara knelt beside the man. The wound in his leg was deep, a ragged tear in his leather trousers and the flesh beneath. It looked like the work of an animal, perhaps a wolf or a cornered cougar. The cold had likely slowed the bleeding, but if he did not get warm, if the wound was not cleaned, he would die. And if he died, they would die, too, trapped in his cabin until they starved or froze. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but the immediate, practical needs overrode it. This was a problem she could, perhaps, solve. She had nursed Daniel through fevers, had learned from her mother the basics of tending to farm injuries. First, the bleeding. She looked around the cabin, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. It was a sparse, masculine space, but meticulously organized. Knives of varying sizes were sheathed in a rack on the wall. Traps hung from the rafters. Sacks of flour and beans were stacked neatly in a corner. She found a pile of clean-looking rags, likely used for cleaning his rifle, and a small kettle hanging by the fire. She filled the kettle with snow she scooped from just outside the door, her hands instantly numb, and set it over the embers to warm. Tearing one of the rags into strips, she pressed a thick wad of cloth directly onto the wound. The man groaned, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the floorboards. His eyelids flickered. For a terrifying second, she thought he would wake, that he would see her and lash out. But he sank back into unconsciousness. His skin was cold to the touch, his lips tinged with blue. He was closer to death than she had realized. Working with a frantic urgency, she stoked the fire, adding log from a pile stacked against the wall until the flames roared to life, casting dancing shadows that made the cabin seem both smaller and more menacing. The warmth began to push back the bone-deep chill, and the kettle began to steam. With warm water and a fresh rag, she began to clean the wound. It was worse than she thought. The flesh was torn, the edges jagged. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to be thorough, her stomach churning at the sight. She found his hunting knife on his belt, a formidable piece of steel, sharp enough to shave with. After holding the tip in the fire until it glowed red, She took a deep breath and began the gruesome work of cutting away the tattered edges of his leather trousers and the deadened flesh around the gash. It was a brutal, necessary act, and with every cut, she prayed he would remain unconscious. Once the wound was as clean as she could make it, she looked for something to stitch it with. In a small wooden chest, she found not thread, but a sinew line and a set of cruelly curved needles. A suturing kit for an animal or a man who lived like one. Her hands trembled as she threaded the needle. She had never done this before, but she had seen the town doctor do it once, on a farmhand who'd had a run-in with a scythe. Taking another steadying breath, she pushed the needle through his cold skin. The first stitch was clumsy, hesitant. The man's body jerked, a reflexive spasm of pain that shot through his unconscious form. Alara flinched, whispering an apology to his unhearing ears. But she continued, her movements becoming more certain, more rhythmic. Stitch after stitch, she pulled the raw edges of the wound together, creating a puckered, ugly seam that was nonetheless closed. Finally, she bandaged the leg tightly with the last of the clean rags. She was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained. The immediate crisis was over, but the larger one remained. She and Lily were trapped in a blizzard in a stranger's cabin, with a wounded giant who might be grateful for her help, or might see her as an intruder to be eliminated. She rose on aching knees and looked at him. He was a terrifying spectacle. Even lying helpless on the floor, he radiated a sense of raw, untamed power. His chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm now, his breathing deeper. The color was starting to return to his face. He would live. She looked over at Lily, who had fallen asleep curled on a bearskin rug by the hearth, her small face peaceful in the firelight. A wave of protective love, so fierce it was almost painful, washed over Alara. Everything she did, every risk she took, was for this small, innocent life. She had faced down Silas Blackwood's threats, trekked into a deadly wilderness, and performed crude surgery on a man who might kill her. She was no longer the timid woman who had wept at her husband's grave. That woman was being stripped away, layer by layer, by the harsh realities of survival. Dragging a heavy fur from the bed, she covered the mountain man. It was an act of mercy, but also one of self-preservation. His survival was tied to hers. As she tucked the fur around his broad shoulders, his eyes opened. They were not the hazy, unfocused eyes of a man lost in delirium. They were sharp, intelligent, and the color of a winter sky just before storm. They locked onto hers, and in their depths, she saw not gratitude, but a cold, hard assessment. He was an apex predator, momentarily wounded, and he was sizing up the strange creature that had invaded his den. The fear she had managed to keep at bay came rushing back, cold and suffocating. She had not saved a man. She had woken the monster. He did not speak. He simply watched her, his gaze unwavering, taking in her worn dress, her chapped hands, and the terror that she knew must be plain on her face. His eyes flickered to Lily, asleep by the fire, and then back to her. A muscle worked in his jaw. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could not move, pinned by the sheer intensity of his stare. She had expected shouting, confusion, perhaps even violence. But this silent, unnerving scrutiny was worse. It was the calm of a wolf before it strikes, the patient stillness of a hunter lining up his shot. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed himself up onto one elbow. The movement was a testament to his immense strength, a clear dismissal of the grievous injury she had just spent an hour stitching. A low grunt of pain escaped him, but his expression remained a mask of stone. His eyes never left hers. He was taking her measure, and she felt herself coming up wanting. She was small, weak, and intruding. She was everything he had not asked for. "Who are you?" His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep underground. It was not a question so much as a demand, a gravelly assertion of his authority in this place. It was a voice used to pleasantries, a tool for conveying meaning in its most basic functional form. Alara swallowed, her throat dry. My name is Alara, she managed, her own voice a pathetic squeak. This is my sister, Lily. We were caught in the storm. It was a half-truth, but it was all she dared offer. To tell him the whole story, to admit she was a fugitive who had lied and schemed her way to his door, seemed like a suicidal act. His gaze swept the room, noting the roaring fire, the displaced kettle, the bloody rags piled in a corner, and finally, the tight, clean bandage on his own thigh. He touched it gingerly with his large, calloused fingers, his expression unreadable. He looked back at her, and the cold assessment in his eyes was now tinged with something else. Confusion. He had expected a bride, a woman sent for, prepared for this life. He had not expected a refugee, a woman and child appearing out of the heart of a blizzard like wraiths. And he certainly had not expected to wake up in his own cabin, patched and tended to by a ghost. The advertisement, he stated, not a question. He was putting the pieces together. Yes, she whispered, relief and terror warring within her. He knew. He was expecting someone. I answered it. We were to meet at the old depot, but the storm, it came on so fast. We saw the light from your cabin, more lies, tumbling out of her in a desperate cascade. She was weaving a flimsy shield of falsehoods, hoping it would be enough to protect them until the storm passed, until she could figure out what to do next. He continued to study her, his silence stretching the tension in the room to a breaking point. Alara felt a hysterical urge to babble, to fill the oppressive quiet with explanations, excuses, anything to placate the wounded giant on the floor. But she held her tongue, sensing that any further words would only deepen his suspicion. He was a man who dealt in realities, not words, and her reality was one of deceit. He would smell on her like a rank perfume. Finally, he shifted his weight, testing his injured leg. He winced, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath that was the first crack in his stoic facade. He was not made of stone, after all. He was flesh and blood, and he was in pain. He looked at the neat line of stitches on his thigh again, then back at her. You did this? He rumbled. I had to, she stammered. You were bleeding. I cleaned it as best I could. He grunted, a sound that could have meant anything from approval to disgust. Pushing himself up further, he leaned his broad back against the stone of the hearth, his long legs stretched out before him. The firelight played over the harsh planes of his face, making the scars stand out in stark relief. He seemed to fill the entire cabin, his presence a physical weight in the air. Alara remained kneeling on the floor, feeling like a supplicant before a grim, pagan god. There's stew in the pot, he said, gesturing with his chin toward a large, black cauldron suspended over the fire. Eat. The girl, too. It was an order, not an invitation. With that, he seemed to dismiss her, closing his eyes as if the effort of a few words had exhausted him. Or perhaps he had simply decided she was not an immediate threat and could be dealt with later. Hesitantly, Alara rose. Her legs were stiff and trembling. She found 2 wooden bowls and spoons on a shelf and ladled out the thick, savory-smelling stew. It was rich with meat and root vegetables, and the aroma made her stomach clench with a hunger so fierce it was painful. She had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days. She gently woke Lily, who blinked sleepily before her eyes went wide, fixing on the huge man by the fire. It's all right, Alara soothed, handing her a bowl. He said we can eat. They ate in silence, huddled together on the bearskin rug, casting nervous glances at the man. He did not move, his eyes remaining closed. He might have been asleep, but Alara knew he was not. He was listening, aware of every small sound they made. The scrape of a spoon against a bowl, Lily's soft sigh of contentment, Alara's own ragged breathing. He was a creature of the wild, and even wounded, his senses were alive, cataloging every detail of their intrusion. When they finished, Alara took the bowls, rinsing them with the last of the warm water in the kettle. She performed the small domestic task with a quiet efficiency, trying to make herself useful, to prove she was not a burden. She was acutely aware of his presence, a silent, brooding judgment that followed her every move. The storm raged outside, a constant, howling reminder of their complete and utter isolation. They were trapped here in this small, warm space with this dangerous, unpredictable man. The debt to Silas Blackwood seemed a distant problem, replaced by the more immediate challenge of surviving Jedediah. As night deepened, the fire became the only source of light. The wind's fury did not abate. Alara made a small bed for Lily near the hearth, tucking her in with a spare blanket. The child, exhausted by the journey and warmed by the food and fire, fell asleep almost instantly. Alara, however, knew she would not sleep. She sat on the rug, her back straight, her senses on high alert, and watched the man. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke again, his eyes still closed. "The bed. Use it." "I can't," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That's your bed." "I'm not moving from this fire," he growled, a note of impatience in his voice. "And I won't have you freezing on the floor. Use the bed." There was no arguing with the finality of his tone. Reluctantly, she moved to the large bed frame. The mattress was stuffed with pine needles and covered in a mountain of soft, thick furs. It smelled of him, of pine and leather, and the clean, sharp scent of the cold. Lying down felt like a profound surrender, an acceptance of his strange, gruff hospitality. She lay stiffly on the very edge of the mattress, as far from the center as possible, pulling only a single fur over herself. She did not undress. She was a guest in a lion's den, and she would be ready to flee at a moment's notice. She lay there in the flickering darkness, listening to the two sounds that defined her new reality: the relentless howl of the blizzard outside, and the slow, deep breathing of the man by the fire. She thought he had fallen asleep, but then his voice came out of the darkness again, low and questioning. "What are you running from?" The question was a knife in the dark, direct and sharp, cutting through all her flimsy lies. He had known. He had known from the moment he saw the terror in her eyes. She did not answer, her heart seizing with a fresh wave of fear. "A woman who belongs in these mountains doesn't look like she's seen a ghost every time a floorboard creaks," he continued, his voice flat. "You're not the woman from the advertisement. You're running from something. Or someone." The truth was a heavy stone in her throat. To admit it was to place herself entirely at his mercy. But to lie again would be pointless. He had already seen through her. Taking a shaky breath, she decided on a partial truth, the part that mattered most. "There's a man," she said, her voice trembling in the dark. "His name is Silas Blackwood. My husband owed him money. When my husband died, he decided the debt was mine to pay, in a way that I could not." The silence that followed her confession was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She could feel his unseen gaze on her from across the room. She had laid her desperation bare, offering it up to him like a sacrificial lamb. "So you ran," he stated. "Here." It was the only place he wouldn't follow, she whispered. "The only place I thought we might be safe." "No place is safe," he rumbled, the words a grim pronouncement. "And you brought your trouble to my door." The accusation, though softly spoken, hit her like a physical blow. It was true. She had not come here seeking a partnership, as his advertisement had offered. She had come seeking a shield, dragging her danger with her, and had found him wounded and vulnerable. She had repaid his unwitting offer of sanctuary by making him a target. Tears of shame and fear welled in her eyes, hot against her cold skin. "I'm sorry," she choked out, the words inadequate. "As soon as the storm breaks, we'll leave. We won't be a burden to you." "Leave?" He scoffed, a dry, humorless sound. "And go where? Back down the mountain to your Mr. Blackwood? Or do you plan to wander the wilderness until you freeze? Use your head." His words were harsh, but they were not cruel. They were practical. He was laying out the grim reality of her situation. There was no escape. She was trapped between a civilized tyrant in the valley and a savage giant in the mountains. A sob escaped her, a sound of pure, unadulterated despair. She clamped a hand over her mouth, muffling the noise, furious at her own weakness. From across the room, there was the sound of movement. He was shifting, and she tensed, her body going rigid with alarm. He let out a long, weary sigh, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire snow-laden world. "Get some sleep," he said, his voice rough, but lacking the hard edge it had held before. "We'll talk in the morning. No one is finding this cabin in this storm. For tonight, you're safe." The promise, offered by this intimidating, wounded man, was the first real comfort Alara had felt in months. It was a temporary reprieve, a stay of execution, but it was enough. Against all odds, exhaustion finally claimed her. She drifted off to sleep in a strange, masculine-scented bed, the howl of the storm a lullaby, her fate in the hands of the mountain man named Jedediah. The next days blurred into a strange, suspended reality. The blizzard did not relent. It cocooned the cabin in a world of white, muffling all sound but the ceaseless moan of the wind. The world was reduced to the four walls of the cabin, the roaring fire, and the three souls within it. A tense quiet settled between them, a period of wary observation. Alara moved about the cabin with a quiet deference, cooking their meals from Jedediah's stores, keeping the fire fed, and tending to his wound. She changed the dressing twice a day, her movements gentle and efficient. The gash was beginning to heal, the angry red of the flesh slowly receding. Jedediah, for his part, remained by the fire. He was a figure of immense, brooding stillness. He rarely spoke, but his eyes followed her everywhere. It was not a threatening gaze, but an intensely curious one. He watched her as she interacted with Lily, his expression unreadable as she braided the child's hair or told her a quiet story. He watched as she mended a tear in Lily's dress with a small sewing kit from her satchel. He watched her as if she were a strange, new species of animal he was trying to understand. Lily, with the guileless innocence of a child, was the first to bridge the chasm of silence. After 2 days of hiding behind Alara's skirts, her curiosity finally won out over her fear. While Jedediah was meticulously sharpening one of his hunting knives with a whetstone, Lily crept closer, her eyes wide with fascination at the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone. Jedediah's hands, which Alara had only seen as instruments of potential violence, moved with a surgeon's precision and an artist's grace. He did not acknowledge the child at first, continuing his work. But then, without looking up, he spoke. "It has to be sharp enough to part a hair," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A dull knife is a dangerous knife. It slips." Lily jumped at the sound of his voice, but she did not run. "Why?" she asked, her own voice a tiny whisper. Jedediah finally paused, looking at the small girl. He seemed to consider her question with a profound seriousness. "Because if you're skinning a buck, a slip can ruin the hide. Or cut you. Out here, a small cut can be a big problem." He finished with the knife, testing the edge with his thumb. Satisfied, he sheathed it and picked up a small block of pine wood and a smaller whittling knife. With a few deft, economic movements, he began to carve. Lily watched, mesmerized as a shape began to emerge from the wood. His large, scarred hands, which could surely snap a man's neck, moved with an astonishing delicacy. He carved away slivers of wood, his focus absolute. Alara watched from across the cabin, her heart in her throat. This was a pivotal moment, though she did not know why. It felt fragile, a delicate truce being negotiated without words. After 10 minutes of silent, focused work, Jedediah held out his hand to Lily. In his palm lay a small, perfectly formed wooden bird, its wings slightly spread as if in mid-flight. Lily looked from the bird to his face, her own expression one of awe. Hesitantly, she reached out and took it. She held it as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. "A bird," she breathed. "A snow bunting," Jedediah said, his voice gruff. "They stay through the winter." Lily clutched the bird to her chest, and, in a sudden, impulsive gesture, she ran to him and threw her small arms around his thick neck, burying her face in his beard. "Thank you," she mumbled into the rough wool of his shirt. Alara froze, expecting him to recoil, to push the child away. He was not a man who seemed accustomed to physical affection. His entire body went rigid, his hands hovering in the air as if he did not know what to do with them. He looked utterly panicked, a grizzly bear being hugged by a field mouse. But then, after a long, tense moment, one of his large hands came to rest gently, almost tentatively, on Lily's small back. He gave her a single, awkward pat. It was the most tender gesture Alara had ever witnessed. It was a nonverbal signal, a crack in the granite facade that told her more than any words could. This man, this wild, solitary giant, was not a monster. He was not a threat to her or her sister. In that single, gentle act, he broke down the wall of fear she had so carefully constructed around her heart. When Lily finally pulled away and ran to show Alara her new treasure, Jedediah would not meet Alara's eyes. A faint flush of color had risen on his neck, visible above his beard. The mountain man was embarrassed. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin was different. The tension had eased, replaced by a quiet sense of domesticity. After Lily was asleep, Alara sat by the fire, mending one of Jedediah's shirts. He sat across from her, cleaning his rifle, the familiar scent of gun oil filling the air. The silence was no longer oppressive, but comfortable, companionable. "You never told me how you got hurt," Alara said softly, breaking the quiet. Jedediah stopped his work, staring into the flames. For a long time, she thought he would not answer. "A wolf," he said finally. "Old male. Got caught in one of my traps. I wanted to put him out of his misery, and he got the better of me for a second. My fault. I got careless." He spoke of a near-fatal encounter as if it were a simple error in calculation, a minor lapse in judgment. "Why do you live up here?" she asked, her curiosity overriding her caution. "Alone." He was silent again, the firelight casting deep shadows on his face. "The world down there," he said, his voice low and laced with a profound bitterness. "It's full of men like your Mr. Blackwood. Men who take. Men who use rules and laws to break people. I saw enough of it. Decided I preferred the honesty of a blizzard. The mountains don't pretend to be anything but dangerous." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and searching. "I had a family once. A wife. A son. Down in the flatlands. There was a fever. It took them both in a week. The doctor, the banker, the preacher, they all offered their sympathies. And then the banker came to take the farm because I couldn't make the planting season. I found I didn't have the patience for that kind of world anymore." The stark, brutal confession hung in the air between them. Alara's own grief felt small and new next to the ancient, weathered sorrow in his voice. She finally understood the deep well of solitude in him. He had not just turned his back on the world. He had been exiled from it by grief so profound it had changed the very landscape of his soul. He had built these mountains around himself as a fortress. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words feeling as inadequate as they had when she first apologized for bringing her trouble to him. "It was a long time ago," he said, his voice flat, dismissing the sentiment. But his eyes told a different story. The pain was still there, banked like the embers of the fire, ready to glow hot with the slightest breath of memory. Emboldened by his own vulnerability, Alara found herself telling him everything. She told him about Daniel's gentle nature and his despair. She told him about the mounting debts, the failed crops, the slow, grinding erosion of their hope. She spoke of Blackwood's predatory patience, how he had waited like a vulture for Daniel to fall, how his condolences at the funeral had felt like a threat. She confessed her lie about the advertisement, her desperate, half-cocked plan to use him as a shield. She laid her entire, pathetic story at his feet, expecting judgment, or perhaps pity. He listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on her face. When she was finished, her voice raw with unshed tears, he simply nodded. "A man like Blackwood," he said, his voice a low growl, "it doesn't stop. He sees you as a possession, something that belongs to him. His pride is wounded. He'll come." "What will we do?" she asked, the wee slipping out unconsciously. Jedediah looked from her to the sleeping form of Lily, and something in his expression shifted. The hardened mask of the recluse softened, replaced by the grim resolve of a protector. He had his own ghosts, his own lost family. In her and Lily, perhaps he saw a chance to guard a future he had been denied. "He'll have to get through me," he said, The words a simple statement of fact. This mountain is my home. I don't let vermin in. He picked up the rifle, the heavy weapon looking like a toy in his massive hands. Tomorrow, the storm is supposed to break. And tomorrow, I teach you how to use this. The promise of violence hung in the air, a stark contrast to the quiet intimacy of the moment. But for the first time since Daniel's death, Alara did not feel afraid. She felt a flicker of something she had thought long dead. Hope. She was no longer a hunted fugitive, alone against the world. She had an ally. A wounded, reluctant, mountain of a man, but an ally nonetheless. And as she looked at him, at the fierce, protective light in his storm-colored eyes, she realized she was no longer just afraid of him. She was beginning to trust him, and that, she knew, was a far more dangerous feeling. The next morning, the world was born anew. The wind had died, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. Alara opened the cabin door to a landscape transformed, a world sculpted from dazzling, untouched white. The snow was piled in deep drifts against the cabin, and every pine bough was heavy with a thick layer of powder. The sky was a brilliant, aching blue, and the air was so cold and clean it felt sharp in her lungs. The blizzard had passed. Their isolation was no longer absolute. True to his word, Jedediah began her training. His leg was still healing, and he moved with a slight limp, but his authority was undiminished. He handed her the rifle. It was surprisingly heavy, the wood smooth and cold, the steel unforgiving. It felt alien in her hands, an object of pure, brutal function. "This is a Sharps," he said, his tone all business. "It'll stop a buffalo, or a man in a thick coat." He showed her how to load it, his large hands guiding her smaller ones, his touch impersonal and instructive. He showed her how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel, how to squeeze the trigger without jerking. "Don't pull it," he commanded. "Squeeze, like you're squeezing water from a stone. A slow, steady pressure. The shot should surprise you." He set up a target, a dark knot in a distant pine tree, and had her practice. The first time she fired, the recoil slammed into her shoulder, a brutal, shocking force that knocked her back a step. The sound was deafening, a sharp crack that shattered the mountain silence and sent snow cascading from the nearby trees. The shot went wild, burying itself harmlessly in a snowbank yards from the target. "Again," he said, his voice implacable. Day after day, they practiced. Alara's shoulder bloomed with a deep, purple bruise. Her ears rang, but slowly, her fear of the weapon was replaced by a grudging respect. She learned to control her breathing, to hold the heavy rifle steady, to anticipate the kick. Her shots grew more accurate, moving from the outer edges of the snowbank to the tree itself, and finally to the area around the knot. Jedediah offered no praise, only curt nods and corrections. "Mind your breathing, keep your elbow tucked, don't anticipate." In the afternoons, a new rhythm of domestic partnership established itself. While he checked his trap lines, moving with a quiet, purposeful grace through the deep snow, Alara and Lily would tidy the cabin, prepare the evening meal, and ensure a roaring fire was waiting for him. When he returned, sometimes with a brace of rabbits or a plump grouse, they would work together to prepare the game. He taught her how to skin a rabbit with a few swift, practiced motions, his instruction as direct and unsentimental as his rifle training. She, in turn, showed him how to make a flaky pie crust, a skill her mother had taught her. They were two disparate worlds colliding, the wild and the domestic, finding a strange and unexpected harmony. The bond between Jedediah and Lily deepened. He carved her a whole family of woodland creatures, a fox, a bear, a tiny, intricate squirrel. He would tell her the names of the birds that visited the clearing, his deep voice softening as he explained the difference between a chickadee and a nuthatch. He was a natural teacher, his knowledge of the wilderness vast and instinctual. He was teaching Lily to see the world as he saw it, not as a hostile enemy, but as a complex system of challenges and resources, a place to be respected and understood. One evening, a week after the blizzard had ended, a new sound broke the mountain silence. It was the jingle of a harness and the soft crunch of snowshoes. A figure emerged from the tree-line, a wiry old man with a beard like a snowdrift and eyes that crinkled at the corners. He led a single, hardy-looking mule laden with packs. Jedediah was instantly on alert, his hand moving to the knife on his belt. He stepped in front of Alara and Lily, shielding them with his body. Ezra, he grunted, his posture relaxing slightly, but not entirely. Jedediah, the old man called out, his voice raspy. Heard you were taking a wife. Didn't figure you for the sociable type. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the pristine snow. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, flickered over Alara and Lily, taking in the scene with a swift, comprehensive glance. Ezra was a trapper, one of the few other humans who dared to make a life in the high country. He and Jedediah shared a grudging respect, a bond forged in mutual solitude. He had come to trade, but he brought something else with him, news from the world below. There's a man down in prosperity, Ezra said, sipping a cup of coffee Alara had poured for him by the fire. A fancy fella, name of Blackwood. He's put the word out, offering $500 for the return of a woman and a girl. Says she's a thief who ran off with his property. The coffee cup in Alara's hand trembled. $500. It was a fortune. It was enough to make any desperate man a bounty hunter. Blackwood was not just trying to find her. He was trying to turn the entire territory against her, painting her as a criminal. Jedediah's face was grim. He's hired men, he stated. It wasn't a question. A handful of them, Ezra confirmed. Not mountain men, town toughs, and hired guns. But they're asking questions. Showing your picture around, he looked at Alara. They know you came north. They're sniffing around the foothills. It won't be long before one of them gets brave enough or greedy enough to try and come up here. The warning hung in the air, heavy and cold. The threat was no longer a distant possibility. It was a mobilized, approaching force. The sanctuary of the cabin suddenly felt fragile, its isolation no longer a shield but a trap. After Ezra left, a new, grim purpose settled over the cabin. The time for training was over. Now, they prepared for a siege. Jedediah became a whirlwind of focused energy. He and Alara worked together, barricading the single window with thick planks of wood, leaving only a small slit to shoot through. They reinforced the door with a heavy crossbar. He showed her where he kept his extra ammunition, a small, hidden cache under a loose floorboard. They'll likely come at dawn, he said, his voice low and calm, as if he were discussing the weather. They'll think to catch us sleeping. They'll try the door first. When that doesn't work, they'll go for the window. You'll be there. He positioned her by the barricaded window, placing the heavy rifle in her hands. Don't shoot unless you have a clear shot. Don't shoot until they're close. Make it count. You have 10 rounds. After that, he handed her a small, vicious-looking pistol. You have this. 6 shots. Aim for the center of the man. His instructions were chillingly practical. He was preparing her for killing. The thought made her stomach turn, but the fear was overshadowed by a cold, hard resolve. She looked at Lily, who was watching them with wide, frightened eyes, clutching her wooden bird. The men who were coming would not just take her back to Blackwood. They would see a witness, a complication. They would not leave Lily unharmed. The image of a rough hand grabbing her sister, of Lily's terrified cry, ignited a fire in Alara's belly. It was a savage, protective fury she had never known she possessed. It burned away the last of her fear, leaving only a core of pure, unyielding determination. She would not let them touch her. I understand, she said, her voice steady. Jedediah would be at the door, using the peephole he had drilled to pick them off as they approached. It was a grim, desperate plan. 2 people, one of them a novice, against a group of armed men. The odds were not in their favor. If it goes bad, Jedediah said, his voice dropping so low Lily could not hear. If they break through, take the girl. They're the loose stone in the back of the fireplace. It leads to a small crawl space. It's not much, but it might give you time. Don't come out. No matter what you hear, he was giving her a way out, a final, desperate chance for her and Lily. He was preparing to die for them. No, she said, her voice fierce. "We fight together. We win together." He looked at her, and for the first time, he smiled. It was not a real smile, just a brief, grim twitch of his lips, but it was a sign of respect. He saw the steel in her spine. He saw the woman who had survived the blizzard, the woman who had stitched his leg, the woman who had learned to shoot. He saw a partner. "All right, Elara," he said, using her name for the first time with a sense of true familiarity. Together, they did not sleep that night. They sat in the dark, silent cabin, listening. Lily slept between them on the floor, a small, warm bundle of innocence in a world about to erupt in violence. Elara held the cold, heavy rifle, its weight of comfort. Jedediah sat like a statue, a sentinel carved from mountain granite, his own rifle across his lap. They waited for the dawn, and they waited for the men who were coming to destroy their fragile peace. The attack came just as Jedediah had predicted, in the gray, pre-dawn light. It began not with a shout, but with a subtle crunch of snow, a sound that did not belong to the forest. Jedediah heard it first, his head snapping up, his body instantly alert. He put a finger to his lips, signaling silence, and moved with a fluid, noiseless grace to his position by the door. Alara's heart began to pound a frantic, suffocating rhythm against her ribs, but her hands on the rifle were steady. She moved to the barricaded window, peering through the narrow slit. She could see them now, 5 shapes moving through the trees, dark figures against the snow. They moved with a clumsy, urban confidence that was ill-suited to the wilderness. These were not mountain men. They were the hired guns Ezra had described, their faces pinched and pale in the cold morning air. One man, clearly the leader, gestured with his rifle, directing 2 others toward the front door, while he and the remaining 2 circled toward the side of the cabin, toward her window. They were trying to be stealthy, but to a man like Jedediah, they sounded like a herd of cattle. He watched through the peephole as the 2 men approached the door, their rifles held at a ready, if unprofessional, angle. They were expecting a simple farmer or no one at all. They were not expecting a fortress. One of the men reached the door and tried the handle. Finding it locked, he grunted in annoyance and put his shoulder to it. It did not budge. He motioned for his companion, and together they threw their weight against the reinforced door. The wood groaned, but the heavy crossbar held firm. "It's barred," one of them shouted, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. From inside, Jedediah smiled, a cold, predatory baring of teeth. "Amateurs," he whispered. He raised his sharps, the long barrel resting in the peephole. He took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion inside the cabin was deafening. Outside, the man who had shouted clutched at his chest, a look of profound surprise on his face. A dark stain spread across his coat. He crumpled to the snow without a sound. His companion stared for a second in disbelief, then let out a yell of panic and fury. He shot Frank. "He's in there. He's armed." He scrambled for the cover of a nearby tree, firing blindly at the door. The bullets thudded into the thick wood, harmless. On the other side of the cabin, the sound of the shot sent the other 3 men diving for cover. Alara's breath hitched. It had begun. The abstract threat was now a terrifying reality of noise and violence. She could see the leader shouting orders, his face a mask of rage. They had walked into a trap, and now they were angry. "Elara, your side." Jedediah's voice cut through her fear, sharp and commanding. She refocused on the slit in the window. The 2 men with the leader were advancing, using the trees for cover, moving toward her position. They were smarter than the first 2. They were trying to create a crossfire. Her hand was slick with sweat on the stock of the rifle. Her target was a man moving between 2 large pines, offering her a fleeting glimpse of his torso. "Squeeze, don't pull. The shot should surprise you." Jedediah's words echoed in her mind. She lined up the shot, her breathing shallow. She tracked the man's movement, led him by a fraction, and squeezed. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the familiar, brutal kick. The recoil felt different this time, charged with a terrifying purpose. Through the slit, she saw the man stumble, cry out, and fall, clutching his leg. She had not killed him, but she had wounded him. He was out of the fight. "Good shot," Jedediah yelled, a note of genuine approval in his voice. He fired again through the peephole, and the second man who had been at the door cried out and fell silent. 2 down. The leader, seeing his men being picked off with such lethal efficiency, let out a roar of frustration. He can't cover both sides at once. Rush him. Burn them out. The man she had wounded was screaming now, a high, panic sound that cut through the morning quiet. The leader ignored him. He and the last remaining gunman began to lay down a volley of covering fire, bullets splintering the logs around the window and the door. Alara ducked instinctively as a slug tore through the wood just inches from her face, filling the air with the smell of scorched pine. Under the cover of the gunfire, the leader pulled a small flask from his coat, uncorked it, and splashed a liquid onto the base of the cabin wall, right below her window. Kerosene. He was going to set the cabin on fire. Her sanctuary, their home, was about to become their tomb. "Jedediah! Fire!" She screamed a raw, desperate cry. Jedediah was already moving. He abandoned the peephole, knowing he couldn't get a clear shot at the man hugging the wall. He grabbed a heavy wood axe that was leaning by the hearth. "Stay down," he bellowed. With a single, powerful kick, he shattered the crossbar on the door and threw it open, charging out into the snow-covered clearing with a roar that was more animal than human. He was a terrifying sight, a giant of a man, wounded but filled with a righteous, protective fury. He moved with the savage grace of a cornered grizzly, the axe held ready. The last gunman, startled by the sudden, suicidal charge, turned his rifle toward Jedediah. Before he could fire, a shot rang out from the cabin window. Alara had seen the danger. Without a second's hesitation, she had leaned back into the window slit, sighted on the gunman, and fired. The bullet struck him in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing his own shot to go wild. He dropped his rifle, screaming in pain. Jedediah did not slow. He was a force of nature unleashed. The leader, his matchbook still in hand, turned to face him, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. He had expected a cowering farmer. He had found a demon. He fumbled for his pistol, but it was too late. Jedediah was on him, the axe swinging in a glittering, deadly arc. The confrontation was brutal and blessedly short. Alara turned away from the window, her stomach heaving. She leaned against the wall, the heavy rifle slipping from her nerveless fingers. It was over. The silence that descended was more profound than the noise that had preceded it. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of shouts and gunshots, a silence that smelled of blood and gunpowder. She heard Jedediah's heavy footsteps approaching the door. He appeared in the doorway, filling the frame. He was covered in snow and splattered with blood that was not his own. His chest was heaving, the adrenaline of battle still coursing through him. He looked at her, his storm-colored eyes searching her face. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. She shook her head, unable to speak. She looked past him at the still forms lying in the snow. Her shot had saved his life. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She, Alara, the timid widow, the hunted fugitive, had taken up a weapon and fought. She had defended her home. She had defended him. Jedediah stepped inside, his gaze falling on Lily, who was now awake and huddled on the floor, her eyes wide with terror, her hands pressed over her ears. He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt before her, his massive frame seeming to shrink as he brought himself down to her level. "It's over, little bird," he said, his voice astonishingly gentle. "The bad men are gone. You're safe." He reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His hand, which had just wielded an axe with lethal force, was impossibly tender. He then looked at Alara, and the look in his eyes was one of raw, unguarded emotion. It was gratitude, respect, and something deeper, something that made her heart ache. "You saved my life," he said simply. In that moment, the final wall between them crumbled. He was not just a protector, and she was not just his ward. They were partners. They had faced death together and had emerged, bloody and shaken, on the other side. The fire that the man had intended to use to destroy them had instead forged them into something new, something strong and unbreakable. But as Alara looked out the door at the carnage in the snow, a new, cold dread settled over her. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. These were just hiremen. The true monster, Silas Blackwood, was still down in the valley, his pride wounded, his possessiveness now inflamed by a desire for vengeance. He would not stop. He would send more men. Or worse, he would come himself, bringing the full weight of his corrupt power with him. They had won the battle, but the war for their survival was far from over. And Blackwood would not be defeated by bullets and axes alone. The aftermath of the violence was a grim, silent affair. Jedediah moved with a grim efficiency, his face a stony mask. He dragged the bodies of the fallen men away from the cabin, into the deep woods, leaving the pristine snow of the clearing stained and violated. Alara watched him from the doorway, a sick feeling churning in her stomach. She had taken part in this, had caused one of those men to fall. The reality of it was a heavy weight on her soul. But when she looked at Lily, who was now quietly playing with her wooden animals by the fire, the guilt was replaced by a fierce, unwavering certainty. She would do it again. 1,000 times, she would do it again to protect this child. Jedediah returned as the sun climbed higher, his expression unreadable. He did not speak of what he had done with the bodies. It was a part of the mountain's brutal calculus, a problem that had been resolved with the same finality as a falling tree. He retrieved the guns from the dead men, lining them up inside the cabin. They now had an arsenal. "They won't be the last," Alara said, voicing the fear that had taken root in her heart. "No," Jedediah agreed, cleaning his rifle with methodical, practiced motions. "Blackwood will hear of this. A man like that can't stand to be defied. He'll take it as a personal insult. He'll send the law," she whispered. "He'll twist the story. He'll say you kidnapped us, that you murdered those men. He has money, influence. They'll believe him." Jedediah stopped his work and looked at her. "The law doesn't come this high up the mountain without a very good reason," he said. "And they don't send lawmen to do a rich man's dirty work if they think they'll be coming back in a pine box. He might try, but his power is in his coin, not in the hearts of men. He'll run out of greedy fools eventually." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they offered little comfort. How many greedy fools would they have to face before Blackwood gave up? Their life had become a siege, their home a fortress. They were living on borrowed time. In the days that followed, a profound change settled over Alara. The terrified woman who had stumbled into the cabin was gone, burned away in the crucible of conflict. She moved with a new confidence, her back straight, her gaze steady. The rifle no longer felt alien in her hands. It felt like an extension of her own will. She continued to practice with it daily, not out of fear, but out of a cold, practical need to be ready. She was no longer a victim waiting to be rescued. She was a defender, a warrior. The bond between her and Jedediah deepened into a quiet, unspoken intimacy. They moved around each other in the small cabin with an easy grace, a partnership forged in shared danger and mutual respect. He would watch her as she read to Lily by the fire, a soft, unreadable expression on his face. She would find herself watching his hands as he repaired a snowshoe or carved a piece of wood, marveling at the contrast between their immense strength and their surprising gentleness. One evening, as she was tending to the fading bruise on her shoulder, he came and stood beside her. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the discolored skin. His touch was feather-light, a stark contrast to the violence that had caused the injury. "I'm sorry you had to do this," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This wasn't the life you were meant for." "Perhaps it was," she replied, meeting his gaze. "Perhaps I was just waiting for a reason to find it." She was no longer the woman who would have been content in the valley, a quiet wife and mother. The mountains and the man who embodied them had awakened something dormant and fierce within her. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them. In his eyes, she saw the vast, lonely wilderness of his past and a dawning hope for a different future. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away. She did not. His lips met hers, and the kiss was nothing like she had expected. It was not the rough, demanding kiss of a savage, but a tender, questioning exploration. It was a kiss that spoke of shared sorrow, of mutual protection, of a fragile hope taking root in the frozen ground. It tasted of wood smoke and winter, and it felt like coming home. When they broke apart, the air in the cabin was charged with a new, potent energy. They were no longer just allies. They were something more, something undefined but powerful. But the shadow of Blackwood still loomed over them, a promise of future violence that made any thought of a peaceful future impossible. The final confrontation came sooner than they expected. It was a week later, on a deceptively beautiful, sunny afternoon. They were not attacked by a posse of hired guns. Instead, a single rider approached the cabin, carrying a white flag of truce. It was Silas Blackwood himself. Jedediah and Alara watched his approach from the cabin, their rifles ready. Blackwood was dressed impeccably in a fine wool coat and leather gloves, looking absurdly out of place in the rugged landscape. He was flanked by two grim-faced men, but they stayed back at the edge of the tree line, their hands visible. Blackwood was putting on a show of civility, but it was a predator's trick, a way to get closer to his prey. "He's a coward," Jedediah growled. "He wouldn't come here unless he thought he had the upper hand. There are more of them." In the trees, Blackwood reined in his horse a safe distance from the cabin. "Alara," he called out, his voice smooth and confident. "I'll come and take you home. This foolishness has gone on long enough. I'm willing to forgive your indiscretion." The sheer arrogance of the man was breathtaking. He spoke as if she were a wayward pet who had merely wandered off. Alara stepped out of the cabin, her rifle held loosely in her hands. Jedediah stood just behind her in the doorway, a silent, menacing shadow. "This is my home now, Silas," she called back, her voice clear and strong. It did not tremble. "You have no business here. Leave." A flicker of annoyance crossed Blackwood's handsome face. He was not used to being defied. "Don't be a fool, my dear. You're with a savage, a murderer. I brought the law with me. The circuit judge himself. They know what he did to my men. Surrender now, and I can promise you leniency. But him," he gestured dismissively at Jedediah, "he will hang." It was a lie, and they all knew it. There was no judge, but it was a threat designed to break her resolve, to turn her against Jedediah. "The only murderer I see is the man who drove my husband to his grave and then tried to claim his widow like a piece of property," Alara shot back, her voice ringing with contempt. Blackwood's mask of civility finally shattered. His face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful little witch," he snarled. "I offered you a life of comfort, and you chose this animal. You will regret this. I will burn this mountain down to get to you." It was the signal. From the trees surrounding the clearing, a dozen more men emerged, rifles raised. They had been surrounded. Blackwood had used himself as bait, and they had fallen for it. "Inside, now," Jedediah yelled, pulling Alara back into the cabin and slamming the door. The first volley of shots rang out, splintering the wood around them. The siege had begun again, but this time, the odds were impossible. The battle was a chaotic, desperate fury. Jedediah and Alara fought back to back, a well-oiled machine of death and defiance. They fired from the door and the window, making every shot count, forcing Blackwood's men to keep their distance. But there were too many of them. The cabin was taking a beating, bullets tearing through the walls, shattering the few possessions they had. A bullet caught Jedediah in the arm, spinning him around. He grunted in pain, but did not fall, switching his rifle to his other shoulder and continuing to fire. But he was bleeding, and his movements were becoming slower. Alara's heart seized with terror. They cannot win this. Not like this. Blackwood, safely behind his line of men, was shouting orders. "Don't kill the woman. I want her alive. Just flush them out." Suddenly, a flaming torch arced through the air, landing on the roof of the cabin. The dry shingles caught instantly. Smoke began to pour into the cabin, thick and acrid. They were being burned alive. "The crawl space," Jedediah choked out, his voice raw from the smoke. "Take Lily. Go." "No." Alara screamed over the roar of the flames. "I'm not leaving you." She looked around frantically, her eyes landing on the sacks of flour stacked in the corner. An idea, desperate and insane, sparked in her mind. "The flour!" she yelled. She grabbed a knife and slit open one of the sacks, then another, throwing the fine white powder into the air. The room filled with a thick, white fog. "What are you doing?" Jedediah coughed, his eyes streaming. "My father was a miner," she gasped. "He told me about dust explosions." She grabbed the last lit lantern, the one she had been about to extinguish. "Get down!" Understanding dawned on Jedediah's face. He grabbed Lily, shielding her with his body and diving to the floor behind the heavy bed frame. Alara took a deep breath, whispered a prayer, and hurled the lantern into the center of the room, into the heart of the flower cloud. The world erupted in a cataclysm of fire and force. The roof of the cabin was blown clean off in a deafening explosion of flame. The walls buckled outwards. The force of the blast threw Blackwood's men back, several of them screaming as they were caught in the fireball. In the ringing silence that followed, Alara pushed herself up from the floor. She was singed and deafened, but she was alive. The cabin was a ruin, open to the sky, the fire already dying down for lack of fuel. Through the smoke and haze, she saw Jedediah rising, pulling a terrified but unharmed Lily from under him. Outside, there was chaos. Blackwood's men were scattered, wounded, and terrified. They had expected a simple siege, not an act of catastrophic, suicidal defiance. They began to fall back, melting into the trees, their will to fight broken. But Blackwood was not running. He stood amidst the chaos, his fine coat ruined, his face blackened with soot, staring at the wreckage of the cabin. His eyes were filled with a homicidal rage. He saw Alara standing there, defiant amidst the ruins, and he lost the last of his reason. He drew his pistol and charged forward, screaming her name. Jedediah started to move, to intercept him, but his wounded arm and the lingering effects of the blast made him slow. He would not make it in time. Alara stood her ground. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear calm. This was it, the final confrontation, not with rifles at a distance, but face to face. She still held the small pistol Jedediah had given her. She had 6 shots. Blackwood raised his own weapon, his face a mask of triumphant hatred. "You're mine," he shrieked. She did not answer. She simply raised her pistol, held it steady with both hands as Jedediah had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. Once, twice. The shots were almost lost in the ringing in her ears. Blackwood stopped dead. A look of complete shock replaced the rage on his face. He looked down at the 2 dark spots spreading on his pristine white shirt. He looked back at her, his mouth opening as if to say something, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. He crumpled to the ground, his reign of terror ending in a patch of bloody snow at the feet of the woman he had tried to own. Alara stood there, the pistol smoking in her hand, as Jedediah finally reached her side. He put his good arm around her, holding her steady. He looked down at the body of Silas Blackwood, then at her. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair was wild, but her eyes were clear and strong. She was no resurrected phoenix rising from the ashes. She was the fire itself. The battle was over. The war was won. They stood together, amidst the ruins of their home, with Lily safe between them. And for the first time, they looked toward a future that was truly their own. In the quiet that followed, the true cost of their victory became apparent. The cabin, their sanctuary, was a smoldering ruin. The roof was gone, one wall was blown out, and most of their meager possessions were destroyed. But they were alive, and they were free. The remaining hired guns had fled, leaving Blackwood's body as a grim monument to his own arrogance. Jedediah, his arm crudely bandaged by Alara, set about the necessary work. He dealt with Blackwood's remains with the same grim detachment he had shown for the others. There was no ceremony. The mountain consumed its own. "We'll have to rebuild," Alara said, her voice quiet but firm as she surveyed the wreckage. Before the next snow, Jedediah looked at her, then at the ruined cabin. "This place is compromised," he said, his voice heavy. "More men might come, looking for him. Lawmen, maybe, or just scavengers. It's not safe here anymore." A cold knot of dread formed in Alara's stomach. She had just found her home, her strength, and now she was about to lose it. "So we'll leave?" she asked, the question laced with a despair she thought she had conquered. "Where will we go?" He was silent for a long time, his gaze distant, looking out over the vast, snow-covered peaks. "I have other places," he said finally. "Smaller cabins, hidden caches, places no one knows about, deeper in the mountains. We could winter there, but it's a hard life, Alara. Harder than this. There would be no town to run to, no trappers passing through. Just us, and the silence." He turned to face her, his expression serious, the lines on his face etched with a familiar solitude. The immediate threat was gone, and the loner, the recluse, was re-emerging. He had protected them, fulfilled the duty that had been thrust upon him. Now, he was preparing to retreat back into his wilderness, to release them from the savage world he inhabited. "Your trouble is over," he said, his voice gruff, avoiding her eyes. "You and the girl, you could go down a mountain now. With Blackwood gone, no one will bother you. You could sell your land, move somewhere new, start over, have a proper life." He was giving her an out. He was setting her free, not just from Blackwood, but from himself. He was a man of the mountains, a creature of solitude and violence, and he believed he had no place in the civilized world she deserved. His duty, as he saw it, was done. He was preparing to leave, to return to the lonely vigil he had kept for so many years. Alara looked at this magnificent, wounded man, this gentle giant who had taken them in, protected them, and taught her how to be strong. She looked at the life he was offering her, a return to the world of towns and people, a world that had betrayed and terrified her. And she looked at the life he was mapping out for himself, a return to his profound, heartbreaking loneliness. The thought of him alone in these vast, silent mountains was more terrifying to her than any threat Blackwood had ever posed. She had not fought and bled and killed just to return to a life that no longer fit her. She had been reshaped by this mountain, by this man. "You think I want to go back there?" she asked, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a fierce, rising emotion. "Back to the world of men like Silas Blackwood? A world that grinds people up and spits them out? I came up this mountain a frightened rabbit, Jedediah. I'm not that person anymore. You taught me that. This mountain taught me that." She stepped closer to him, her gaze unwavering. "You talk about a proper life. What is that? A life of quiet desperation in a town full of whispers and judgment? Or a life of truth, of hardship, of earning every single sunrise? You said the mountains were honest. I've found more honesty here in this ruined cabin than I ever knew in the valley." She reached out and took his good hand, her smaller one enfolding his large, calloused fingers. "My trouble isn't over, Jedediah. It's just beginning. My trouble is figuring out how to rebuild a roof over our heads. My trouble is making sure Lily grows up strong and unafraid. My trouble," she paused, her voice softening, "is convincing a stubborn, solitary man that he doesn't have to be alone anymore." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. "Don't send us away," she whispered, her plea raw and honest. "We're not your burden. We're your family. This is our home. With you, if you'll have us." Jedediah stared at her, his face a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. He had spent years building walls around his heart, fortifying himself against the pain of loss. He had accepted his solitude as a penance, a permanent state of being. And now, this incredible woman, this fierce survivor, was tearing down those walls with her bare hands, offering him a gift he had never dared to want again: a home, a family, a future. He looked from her determined, tear-streaked face to Lily, who was watching them with a child's solemn understanding. He saw his lost son in her innocent eyes, his lost wife in Alara's unwavering strength. But they were not ghosts. They were real, warm, and alive. They were a second chance he had never believed he deserved. The choice was clear: A life of lonely, silent survival, or a life of noisy, complicated, beautiful love. He had been the tamed wild, a solitary beast. But she was offering him a pack, a purpose beyond just breathing. Slowly, he raised his hand and cupped her face, his thumb gently wiping away a tear. The rough, callous skin was a comforting weight against her cheek. "Elara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had not felt in a decade. He could not find the words to express the monumental shift that was occurring within him, the melting of a glacier that had been frozen for years. So he did the only thing he could. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or of tentative discovery. It was a kiss of acceptance, a kiss of homecoming. It was a silent, unbreakable promise. When he pulled back, the solitude was gone from his eyes, replaced by a light she had never seen there before. It was peace. "All right," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "We'll need more logs for the new walls. And I know a place where the pines grow straight and tall." He was not just talking about rebuilding the cabin. He was talking about building a life. Their life. Together. Elara smiled, a true, radiant smile that lit up her soot-stained face. She looked at the ruins around them, at the vast, intimidating wilderness stretching in every direction, and she felt no fear. She was home. With her daughter by her side and her mountain man holding her hand, they stood together under the wide, bruised iron sky, ready to face whatever came next. The winter was far from over, but in the warmth of their new, forged family, they had all the heat they would ever need. A fresh start was not about finding a new place, but about finding your people, and in the heart of the most savage wilderness, they had found theirs.